I never thought I'd be sitting across from my own brother in a lawyer's office, watching him smirk as he called me useless to my face. But there I was, in that sterile conference room with its beige walls and uncomfortable chairs, feeling like my entire world was crumbling around me. The thing is, I'd spent my whole life believing he was right. I'd spent 34 years thinking I was the family disappointment, the one who never quite measured up, the one who couldn't do anything right. Until that moment when the lawyer turned to me and said those 5 words that changed everything. Your counsel will respond now. You see, my name is Sarah, and if you're watching this, I want you to know that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who are supposed to love us unconditionally. And sometimes, just sometimes, life gives you a moment where you get to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever felt like you weren't good enough, please hit that subscribe button because I share real stories about real people overcoming real challenges, and I think you'll find something here that speaks to your heart. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the story of that mediation isn't really about the mediation at all. It's about 2 kids who grew up in the same house but lived completely different lives. My brother David was always the golden child. He was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I could walk, I was trying to keep up with him. He was the star athlete, the honor roll student, the one who made our parents beam with pride at every family gathering. I was the awkward younger sister who tried too hard, who stumbled over her words, who couldn't seem to do anything without making a mess of it. Growing up, David had this way of looking at me that made me feel about 2 inches tall. It wasn't just sibling rivalry, though I spent years telling myself that's all it was. It was something deeper. Something that seemed to say I was fundamentally less than him, less capable, less worthy of taking up space in our family. When I'd try to join in his games with his friends, he'd roll his eyes and say, "Sarah can't play, she'll just mess it up." When I'd show our parents a drawing I'd made or a story I'd written, he'd glance at it and say, "That's nice, I guess," in that tone that somehow made nice sound like an insult. The worst part wasn't even what he said. It was how everyone else seemed to agree with him. Our parents would laugh off his comments as typical sibling teasing, but they never quite defended me either. They'd just redirect the conversation or change the subject. It was like they were saying, without saying it, that maybe David had a point. Maybe I wasn't as special as I thought I was. This dynamic followed us into adulthood. David went to Harvard, got his MBA, married his college sweetheart Rebecca, and started a successful consulting firm. He bought a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and a 2-car garage. He had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, who were already showing signs of inheriting his natural confidence and charisma. Meanwhile, I bounced between jobs, went through a messy divorce, and struggled to make ends meet as a single mom to my daughter Emma. Every family gathering was a reminder of our different paths. David would arrive in his BMW, wearing his expensive suits, talking about his latest business deals and vacation plans. I'd show up in my used Honda Civic, wearing clothes from Target, trying to contribute to conversations about things I knew nothing about. And David, whether he meant to or not, always found ways to highlight the contrast. He'd ask me about my little projects in that condescending tone, or he'd make jokes about my bohemian lifestyle that weren't really jokes at all. But here's the thing that nobody knew, not even David. I hadn't been sitting around feeling sorry for myself all these years. While he was climbing the corporate ladder, I was quietly building something of my own. You see, after my divorce, I'd started a small online business. It began as a way to make extra money, selling handmade jewelry from my kitchen table. But slowly, over the course of several years, it grew into something bigger. I discovered I had a talent for design. And more importantly, I had a gift for connecting with people. My little jewelry business evolved into a full-fledged e-commerce company. I started creating custom pieces for clients, then expanded into home decor, then into consulting for other small businesses who wanted to build their online presence. I was working 18-hour days, teaching myself about digital marketing, web design, supply chain management, and customer service. I was learning things David had paid Harvard tens of thousands of dollars to learn, except I was learning them in the real world with real consequences for every mistake. The business grew slowly at first, then faster. I hired my first employee, then my second, then my third. I moved out of my apartment and into a small warehouse space. I started getting featured in local newspapers and magazines. But I never talked about any of this with my family, partly because I was so used to being dismissed that I didn't want to risk having my accomplishments minimized, and partly because I was scared that if I talked about it, it might all disappear. The irony is that while David was building his life on the foundation of what other people thought of him, I was building mine on the foundation of what I could prove to myself. Every small victory, every satisfied customer, every month where I could pay my bills and have money left over was proof that maybe I wasn't as useless as I'd been made to feel all my life. But families have a way of pulling you back into old patterns, don't they? Even when you've grown and changed and become someone new, the people who knew you when you were young can still see you exactly as you were. And that's exactly what happened when our grandmother passed away. Grandma Rose had been the matriarch of our family, the one person who'd always made me feel like I belonged. She'd lived in the same house for 60 years, the house where our mom had grown up, where David and I had spent countless weekends and holidays. When she died at 93, she left behind not just a lifetime of memories, but also a house full of antiques, collectibles, and family heirlooms that nobody quite knew how to handle. The will was simple. Everything was to be divided equally between David and me. But as anyone who's ever dealt with an estate knows, equally is a lot more complicated than it sounds. How do you divide a house? How do you put a price on 60 years of accumulated possessions? How do you split up a lifetime of memories? At first, David and I tried to handle it ourselves. We met at the house a few times, walking through the rooms, making lists, trying to figure out what was valuable and what wasn't. But it quickly became clear that we had very different ideas about how to proceed. David wanted to sell everything as quickly as possible, split the money, and be done with it. He saw the whole process as a business transaction, something to be handled efficiently and without emotion. I, on the other hand, wanted to take time to go through everything carefully. I wanted to preserve the family history, to make sure items went to family members who would appreciate them, to honor Grandma Rose's memory by treating her possessions with respect. I suggested we donate some items to charity, keep others for our children, and only sell what we absolutely had to. David's response was immediate and cutting. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. It's just stuff. Grandma's gone, and holding on to a bunch of old junk isn't going to bring her back. We need to be practical about this." But it wasn't just stuff to me. It was Grandma Rose's sewing machine, where she'd taught me to hem my first dress. It was her collection of recipe cards, written in her careful handwriting, with notes about which dishes were favorites and which ones needed more salt. It was her jewelry box, filled with pieces that told the story of her life, from her engagement ring to the charm bracelet we'd added to every Christmas. Our disagreement escalated quickly. David accused me of being sentimental and impractical. I accused him of being cold and money-focused. We started having conversations that sounded more like arguments, and arguments that sounded more like fights. The tension that had simmered between us for years finally boiled over. The breaking point came when I discovered that David had already contacted a estate sale company without telling me. He'd had someone come to the house to appraise everything, and he'd scheduled a sale for the following month. When I found out, I was furious. Not just because he'd gone behind my back, but because he'd made a decision about our grandmother's life without even consulting me. "You had no right to do that," I told him over the phone. "We were supposed to make these decisions together." "I'm trying to save us time and hassle," he said, his voice taking on that familiar condescending tone. "You're not thinking clearly about this, Sarah. You never think clearly about anything. You're too emotional, too attached to things that don't matter." And there it was. The same dismissive attitude I'd been dealing with my whole life. The same assumption that because I cared about something, it must be foolish or impractical. The same belief that his way was the only reasonable way. "I'm calling my lawyer," I said. "Your lawyer?" David actually laughed. "Sarah, you don't have a lawyer. You can barely afford to fix your car, let alone hire legal representation." That laugh was what did it. That laugh that said I was delusional, that I was playing at being a grown-up, that I was still the same useless little sister who couldn't do anything right. That laugh made me realize that no matter how much I'd grown, no matter how much I'd accomplished, David was never going to see me as anything other than the family failure. But here's what David didn't know. I did have a lawyer. In fact, I had a whole team of lawyers. When my business had started growing, I'd realized I needed legal advice for contracts, intellectual property, and business partnerships. I'd found a firm that specialized in helping small businesses, and over the years, they'd become not just my legal advisors, but trusted partners in my success. The lead attorney, Michelle Rodriguez, had become something of a mentor to me. She was a woman who'd built her own practice from nothing, who understood what it was like to be underestimated and overlooked. When I called her about the estate situation, she listened carefully and then said something that surprised me. "Sarah, based on what you're telling me, I think your brother may be in violation of his fiduciary duty as co-executor of the estate. He can't make unilateral decisions about the sale of assets without your consent. We need to file for mediation immediately." I'd never heard the term fiduciary duty before, but Michelle explained it to me. As co-executors, David and I were legally required to act in the best interests of the estate and to make decisions together. By scheduling the estate sale without my consent, David had potentially violated that duty. More importantly, Michelle explained, if we could prove that his actions were motivated by self-interest rather than the best interests of the estate, we might be able to challenge his role as co-executor entirely. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in downtown offices that looked like something out of a legal drama. All glass and steel and intimidating artwork. I'd been there before for business meetings, but this felt different. This felt personal. I arrived early, wearing one of my best business suits, carrying a leather briefcase that Michelle had recommended I bring to look professional. I'd spent the weekend preparing, reviewing documents, organizing my thoughts, and mentally preparing for what was going to be an emotionally difficult conversation. David arrived 15 minutes late, looking harried and slightly annoyed. He was wearing an expensive suit, but it was wrinkled, and he had that slightly manic energy of someone who was juggling too many things at once. He took one look at me sitting there with my briefcase and my prepared documents and rolled his eyes. "Really, Sarah? You're going to make a big production out of this?" The mediator, a stern-looking woman named Janet Morrison, called us to order before I could respond. She explained the process, the ground rules, and the goals of the mediation. Then she asked David to present his position first. David launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about the practicalities of estate management. He talked about market conditions, the costs of maintaining property, the complexity of dividing assets. He presented spreadsheets and timelines and charts that made his position look logical and reasonable. But then he made a mistake. He started talking about me. "The problem is," he said, glancing at me with that familiar look of irritation, "my sister has always been impractical. She's never been good with money, never been good with business decisions. She's letting her emotions cloud her judgment, and it's going to cost us both money in the long run." I felt the familiar sting of his words, the way they made me feel small and incompetent. But this time, something was different. This time, I had Michelle sitting next to me, and I could see her taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each dismissive comment David made. David continued, "Sarah's never been successful at anything she's tried. She's never held down a steady job, never built anything lasting. She doesn't understand how the real world works, and she's too emotional to make rational decisions about this estate." The word useless came next. He didn't say it directly, but it was implied in every sentence. He was painting a picture of me as someone who was incapable of handling adult responsibilities, someone who needed to be protected from her own poor judgment. "She's basically useless when it comes to business matters," he said finally, and there it was. The word I'd been hearing my whole life, spoken out loud in a room full of professionals. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. Part of me wanted to shrink down in my chair to let David take control the way I'd been doing my whole life. But then I looked at Michelle, and she was smiling. Actually smiling. Janet Morrison turned to me and said, "Sarah, would you like to respond to your brother's characterization of the situation?" I started to open my mouth, but Michelle put a gentle hand on my arm. "Actually," she said, "I think this would be a good time for Ms. Patterson's counsel to present her position. Your counsel will respond now." The change in the room was immediate. David's eyes widened. Janet Morrison looked interested. Even the court reporter seemed to perk up, because suddenly it was clear that this wasn't just a family dispute between a successful businessman and his impractical sister. This was a legal matter between two parties, each with professional representation. Michelle opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Thank you, Janet. Before we address the specific issues around the estate sale, I'd like to provide some context about Ms. Patterson's qualifications to make business decisions. She started with my business. Not the way I might have described it, downplaying its success or apologizing for its modest beginnings. She presented it the way a lawyer presents evidence. She had documents, she had financial statements, she had tax returns and business licenses and incorporation papers. Ms. Patterson is the founder and CEO of Patterson Design Associates, Michelle said, a successful e-commerce and consulting business that has generated over $2 million in revenue over the past 5 years. I watched David's face as Michelle continued. His smirk faded first, then his confident posture started to crumble. He kept glancing at me like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Ms. Patterson's business serves over 5,000 clients nationwide, Michelle continued. She employs 12 full-time employees and has been recognized by the Small Business Administration for her contributions to the local economy. She has extensive experience in asset management, inventory control, and the valuation of collectibles and antiques. Michelle pulled out more documents, letters of recommendation from clients, awards from business organizations, articles from trade publications where I'd been quoted as an expert in small business development. In fact, Michelle said, Ms. Patterson's expertise in valuing and marketing collectibles makes her uniquely qualified to assess the items in the estate. She has specific knowledge about the market for mid-century furniture, vintage jewelry, and historical artifacts. David was staring at me now, his mouth slightly open. I could see him trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the business owner Michelle was describing. But Michelle wasn't done. She pulled out another set of documents. Ms. Patterson has also been working with a team of appraisers to conduct a thorough evaluation of the estate's assets. Based on their preliminary assessment, the estate sale that Mr. Patterson scheduled would result in a significant financial loss to the estate. She spread out photographs and appraisal documents on the table. For example, this dining room set that Mr. Patterson's estate sale company valued at $800 has been appraised by a certified antique appraiser at $4,000. This collection of costume jewelry that was going to be sold as a lot for $50 contains several pieces that are worth more than $500 each. I watched David's confident expression crumble completely as Michelle continued to present evidence of his mistakes. The estate sale company he'd chosen was known for quick sales and low prices, not for maximizing value. The appraisal he'd relied on was cursory and inaccurate. His timeline was driven by his own convenience, not by the best interests of the estate. Based on our analysis, Michelle said, Mr. Patterson's proposed estate sale would cost the estate approximately $50,000 in lost revenue. $50,000. The number hung in the air like a sword. David's face had gone pale, and I could see him doing the math in his head. $25,000 was his share of the loss, money that his hasty decision would have cost him. But Michelle still wasn't finished. She pulled out one more document, and this one made my heart skip a beat because I'd never seen it before. There's also the matter of Ms. Patterson's proposal for the family home, Michelle said. Ms. Patterson has submitted a formal offer to purchase Mr. Patterson's half of the property at fair market value, allowing her to preserve the family home while providing him with his full inheritance. I stared at Michelle, then at the document in her hands. We'd talked about this possibility, but I'd never seen the actual offer, never seen the numbers written out in legal language. The offer was for more than David would get from a quick sale, and it would allow me to keep the house that meant so much to our family history. David found his voice first. Wait, what? Sarah, you can't afford to buy a house. You don't have that kind of money. Michelle smiled that professional smile again. Ms. Patterson has been pre-approved for a business loan to purchase the property. She plans to convert part of the house into a showroom for her design business while preserving the family living areas. The room was quiet for a long moment. David looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Janet Morrison was taking notes. The court reporter was typing steadily. Finally, David turned to me. Sarah, I don't understand. When did you, how did you, I mean, you never said anything about having a business. And that's when I found my voice. Not the voice of the little sister who'd been dismissed and overlooked for 34 years, but the voice of the woman who'd built something from nothing, who'd proven herself in the real world, who'd earned the right to be taken seriously. You never asked, David, I said quietly. You never asked me what I was doing with my life. You never asked me about my work, my goals, my dreams. You just assumed I was the same person I was when we were kids. I took a breath and continued. You know what's funny? All these years, I thought you were right about me. I thought I was useless, that I couldn't do anything right. But while you were busy looking down on me, I was building something real. I was learning and growing and becoming the person I was meant to be. David was shaking his head. But you never told us. At family dinners, you never mentioned any of this. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you'd change the subject or make a joke about my little projects. Because every time I showed any pride in what I was doing, you'd find a way to minimize it. Because I learned early that the safest thing to do was to stay quiet and let you have the spotlight. I could see the impact of my words on David's face. He was remembering those family dinners, those conversations where he'd dismissed my attempts to contribute, those moments where he'd made me feel like I had nothing valuable to add. I'm not the same person I was when we were kids, David, I continued. I'm not the little sister who couldn't do anything right. I'm a successful business owner, a good mother, and someone who's earned the right to be treated with respect, especially by my own brother. The mediation continued for another 2 hours, but the dynamic had completely shifted. Instead of David making decisions and me trying to keep up, we were negotiating as equals. Michelle and David's lawyer, who'd been mostly quiet up to that point, worked through the details of my offer to buy the house, the timeline for settling the estate, and the division of assets. But the real transformation wasn't in the legal documents. It was in the way David looked at me. For the first time in our lives, he was seeing me as an adult, as someone capable of making important decisions, as someone worthy of his respect. When we finally reached an agreement, David asked if he could speak to me privately. We stepped out into the hallway, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. Sarah, he said finally, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for years. For decades, really. I waited for him to continue. I had no idea about your business, about what you'd built. I'm genuinely impressed, and I'm sorry I never took the time to learn about it. Thank you, I said simply. But more than that, he continued, I'm sorry for the way I've treated you, the way I've talked about you, talked to you. I guess I got stuck thinking about you as my little sister, and I never updated that picture. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of finally being seen for who I really was. The thing is, David, I said, I needed to prove to myself that I was capable before I could prove it to anyone else, and maybe you needed to see it this way, in a professional setting, to really understand who I've become. He nodded. I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm proud to be your brother. We hugged in that corporate hallway, surrounded by the sterile efficiency of the business world, but sharing a moment that was anything but sterile. It was messy and emotional and real, the way family moments should be. The paperwork took another few weeks to finalize, but the hard part was over. I bought David's half of the house, and he got his inheritance in cash. More importantly, we'd found a way to honor Grandma Rose's memory while respecting both of our needs. But the real victory wasn't in the legal documents or the financial arrangements. It was in the phone call I got from David a few weeks later. Sarah, he said, Rebecca and I were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend. We'd love to hear more about your business, and I was thinking maybe you could give us some advice about the website for my consulting firm. It was such a simple invitation, but it meant everything. It meant that David was ready to see me as someone who had something to offer, someone whose expertise was valuable, someone whose opinion mattered. The dinner was wonderful, but not because everything was suddenly perfect between us. It was wonderful because it was real. David asked genuine questions about my business, and I asked genuine questions about his. We talked about our kids, our challenges, our dreams for the future. We talked like adults, like equals, like siblings who actually liked each other. Rebecca later told me that David had spent the entire week before the dinner researching my business online, reading articles about me, looking at my company's website. He'd been trying to understand how he'd missed so much of my life, how he'd been so wrong about who I was. He's been beating himself up about it, she said, but I think he's also excited to get to know this version of you. That conversation happened 6 months ago, and I wish I could tell you that everything has been perfect since then. But real life doesn't work that way. David and I still have moments where we fall back into our old patterns, where he gets condescending and I get defensive. But now we have the tools to recognize what's happening and to correct course. More importantly, we have a foundation of mutual respect that didn't exist before. David knows that I'm capable of handling complex business decisions, and I know that he's capable of seeing me as more than the little sister who couldn't do anything right. The house has become everything I hoped it would be. I've converted the front rooms into a showroom for my design business, but I've kept the kitchen and the family room exactly as Grandma Rose left them. Emma loves having her own room in the house where her great-grandmother lived, and she's been helping me catalog and preserve all the family photos and documents that David would have sold. My business has continued to grow, partly because having a physical showroom has attracted local customers who never would have found me online, but mostly because I've finally learned to talk about my work with pride instead of apologizing for it. I've learned that confidence isn't arrogance, and that success isn't something to be ashamed of. The most unexpected outcome of all this has been the relationship between David and Emma. He's become the uncle he never was before, taking genuine interest in her life and her activities. She adores him, and he's been teaching her about business and finance in ways that make her feel capable and confident. Uncle David says I'm going to be a great entrepreneur someday, Emma told me recently. He says I have good ideas, and I'm not afraid to try new things. It struck me that David was giving Emma what he'd never given me at her age, the belief that she was capable of great things. Maybe that's how families heal, one generation at a time. Looking back on that day in the mediation room, I realized that the moment that changed everything wasn't when Michelle said, "Your counsel will respond now." It was when I decided that I was worthy of having counsel in the first place. It was when I decided that my perspective mattered, that my business was worth protecting, that my voice deserved to be heard. For so many years, I'd accepted David's assessment of me because I didn't have any evidence to contradict it. But success isn't just about making money or building a business. It's about becoming the person you're meant to be, even when the people around you can't see who that is. I think about all the times I stayed quiet at family dinners, all the times I let David's dismissive comments slide, all the times I apologized for taking up space. I think about how different things might have been if I'd found my voice sooner, if I'd demanded to be taken seriously as an adult. But I also think about how the journey of building my business, of proving myself to myself, was something I needed to do alone. I needed to know that I was capable before I could convince anyone else. I needed to build something real before I could defend it. The truth is, we all have people in our lives who see us as we used to be instead of who we've become. Sometimes those people are family members, sometimes they're old friends, sometimes they're voices in our own heads. But we don't have to accept those old definitions of ourselves. We can grow and change and become someone new, even if it takes years for the people around us to notice. If you're watching this and you feel like you're stuck in someone else's definition of who you are, I want you to know that you have the power to change that story. You have the power to build something new, to prove yourself wrong about your own limitations, to surprise the people who think they know you. It might take time. It might take building something in secret, like I did. It might take sitting in a lawyer's office, facing down the person who's been dismissing you for years. But the moment when you finally get to say, "Actually, you're wrong about me," is worth every difficult step along the way. David and I talk regularly now about business and family and life. We still don't always agree, but we respect each other's perspectives. He asks for my advice about his business, and I ask for his advice about mine. We're finally the siblings we should have been all along. Last month, he sent me a text message that I've saved on my phone. It said, "I was wrong about you for so long, and I'm sorry, But I'm grateful that you never gave up on becoming who you were meant to be." I wrote back, "I'm grateful too. And I'm grateful that you were willing to see me differently when I finally showed you who I really was." The house is quiet now as I finish telling you this story. Emma is upstairs doing her homework, and I'm sitting in Grandma Rose's kitchen, surrounded by the family history that I fought so hard to preserve. The business is thriving, David and I are closer than we've ever been, and I finally feel like I'm living the life I was meant to live. But the most important thing I've learned is that our worth isn't determined by whether other people recognize it. Our value isn't diminished by being overlooked or dismissed. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to accept someone else's limitations for your life. So tell me, have you ever had a moment where you got to prove someone wrong about who you are? Have you ever surprised yourself with your own capabilities? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own journey of becoming who you were meant to be, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes we all need to be reminded that we're more capable than we think we are, that we're worthy of respect, and that it's never too late to rewrite the story of who we're supposed to be. Sometimes we all need someone to say, "Your counsel will respond now," and give us the floor to speak our truth. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me as I really am. And remember, no matter who has dismissed you or overlooked you or called you useless, you have the power to prove them wrong. You have the power to build something beautiful with your life, and you deserve to be proud of what you create. The conversation ends here, but your story is just beginning. I believe in you, and I can't wait to see what you build.